Hi, this is Randall Schwartz, host of Floss Weekly. This week, Aaron Newcomb joins me. We're going to be talking about Ionic, the framework that lets you run on iOS, Android, and desktop. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Floss Weekly with Randall Schwartz and Aaron Newcomb. Episode 526, recorded April 17th, 2019. Ionic. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Smart Deploy. Smart Deploy allows IT departments to re-image unlimited computer models from one golden image. Search the library for your models and get 15 free licenses with a year of support. That's $720 worth of free IT software at smartdeploy.com/floss. And by DigitalOcean. Deploy your apps on the simplest cloud platform with no surprises. Join a community of over 3.5 million developers on DigitalOcean. Sign up today and receive a free $100 credit at do.co/twit. It's time for Floss Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week the movers, the shakers, the big projects, little projects you may be using every day and not aware of it. And I bet this is one of those. Projects you might want to download right after this show and play with. And I bet this is also going to be one of those. It's maybe one of the two things where both of those are true. Joining me once again is my lovely and talented co-host, Aaron Newcomb. Aaron, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks. How's it going, Randall?
I haven't seen you, in a few weeks? I haven't seen you since Google Plus went away. That's what we were debating before the show, is what to put for your lower third, because there used to be a Plus Aaron Newcomb, and now it's nothing, and it's kind of like trash and stuff, yeah. Well,
it's so sad. That's like the last thing I was hanging on to from Google Plus was my lower third.
Yeah. That'll work. I am speaking to you from the Tijuana kitchen, just like the Tijuana kitchen set, we call it, just like last week. And no, the magnets still haven't moved. They've been in that position for years. I don't know if they're ever going to move. Actually, I go over and move them right after the show. That way, next time I come here, I can go, hey, the magnets are moved. See if you can figure out which one it is. But anyway, and you look like you're in your wife's makerspace.
Yeah, that's my wife's makerspace back there, and my makerspace is right here. You can't really see it because it's facing the wrong direction. So yeah, her makerspace is all about books. She's an English teacher, so she's got all her papers back there that she's grading and all that. And I have all my electronics splayed out in front of me here. Look at this nice little guy right here. In fact, look at that. Ooh,
oh, cool! It's like a little board.
All kinds of cool stuff. Yeah, a little Raspberry Pi and an ESP.
How little bored are you? Yes.
Ooh, bad joke of the day.
I know. It's horrible for that. So anyway, I'm next week I'll actually be home, so you'll actually see the big blue Yeti, not the little Yeti Nano that I'm using today. But the sound's not bad on this. I've been listening to some of these shows, and the sound's not been that bad. It's certainly better than when I was using my my headset. My not to say anything bad about Plantronics headsets, but definitely a little crazy there. So today we have an interesting project. We always have interesting projects, but today we have an interesting project. We're going to be bringing Max Lynch on in a few minutes, and he's going to be talking to us about Ionic. And what I've been saying for the last 6 or 7 weeks is Ionic Framework is a free open source mobile UI toolkit for delivering high quality cross-platform apps for native iOS, Android, and the web, all from a single code base. This is a very interesting space to be in these days. I'm, of course, all up on Flutter. So I've been looking a lot at what Google's been doing in this space. Ionic is actually a much older project, though, and has a lot more people using it outside of Google these days. So, I mean, Google's heavily invested internally in Flutter and Angular Dart and a few other things, but Ionic's been around for a lot longer, and so we're going to get into some of that and the history of the project, things like that, with Max in a few minutes. And I also, I say probably just right off the top of the show, and I think I've said this a couple times during the show closings the last few weeks, the thing about Ionic is you're programming using standard web standards. In other words, JavaScript, CSS, web components, PWA, and what's the other thing that's like that? There's one other item. Yeah, well, someday I'll remember it. Maybe I'll remember it in the middle of the show. That'll be cool. So what do you know about this so far?
Yeah, so we actually support this at work. We support Ionic applications through our mobile product, our mobile monitoring product. And it's basically because so many people are using it. So not only this, but other frameworks like this, like React and Angular, Cordova, all of those puzzle pieces that people use to develop apps these days, that where they don't want to necessarily develop in the native language or the native toolkit that is provided by either Apple or Google for mobile. So a lot of developers are using this. It's really popular. I've played around with some of them. And you can develop apps very, very quickly. And especially if you're used to developing in JavaScript and CSS for native web apps, I mean, this makes it really easy to get up and going with a mobile app that looks beautiful and works how you expect. So I'm really interested to see what's coming next. I heard there's some rumors about some studio project and what's that all about. So there's all kinds of stuff I'm interested in for sure.
Cool. Well, it sounds like you're the perfect co-host for this show, so thank you for stepping up again today. But before we bring on Max Lynch, let's go ahead and talk about who's paying the bills today. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Smart Deploy. Smart Deploy allows IT departments to re-image unlimited computer models from one golden image. They offer one-click user data migration for simplified migrations, zero-touch network deployment, imaging over the internet, and application deployment to make your project stress-free. Whether you have 50 or 50,000 computers at your company, their patented device driver injection technology combined with technician-built driver packages called platform packs make your life easier. Their library of over 1,200 platform packs includes Lenovo, HP, and Dell, and all other major OEMs. When you need to support a new model, just download the pack and deploy your golden image to any business-class computer. Smart Deploy is the most reliable, easy-to-use solution that has been trusted to deploy over 2.2 million endpoints. It's the first and only solution to offer imaging over Wi-Fi, meaning you can now manage your remote users in satellite offices without being connected to the same network. Deploy images, apps, and updated drivers to your endpoints via the cloud using Dropbox, Google Drive, OneDrive, or OneDrive for Business cloud storage. Step-by-step wizards will guide you through the process in complicated steps like sysprep, are handled for you automatically. Include an answer file to automate tasks like domain join and computer naming for hands-free, zero-touch deployment. No ramp-up or training necessary. Migrate 100 computers to Windows 10 in under an hour with out-of-the-box multicast support. Their Seattle-based support team is made up of imaging and Windows experts, and they're just an email or phone call away. Companies like Nintendo, UCLA, and Nissan turn to Smart Deploy to make the dreaded task of computer imaging a bit less painful. And right now, Smart Deploy is giving our audience 15 free licenses with 1 year of support. That's $720 worth of free IT software at smartdeploy.com/floss. If you work at a company with 50 to 50,000 computers, head to smartdeploy.com/FLOSS to get 15 free licenses with 1 year of support. And we thank Smart Deploy for their sponsorship of Floss Weekly. Now let's go ahead and bring our guest. Max, welcome to the show.
Hey. Thanks for having me, guys.
And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. That's the headquarters of basically where Ionic started and where the company behind Ionic is based.
Cool. And so give us the 30,000 foot view. Let's start this out. So what problem are you solving when you're reaching for Ionic?
Yeah, so Ionic is all about solving a people problem in the sense that if you are a web developer, you have a traditional web development background, you can use Ionic to build mobile apps, desktop apps, and web apps. So it pretty much turns you into an app developer using your existing web dev skills.
So we should probably clarify, I think most people are probably, especially if you're listening to this show, you're probably in the mobile space already. But one of the big challenges in mobile development is that, iOS is all built using iOS's interfaces and built using Objective-C, or now modern versions are more about Swift. And on the other side, on Android, you had to write a whole separate code base because you're building with Java originally and now Kotlin, which is a much nicer version of Java. I think that's even possible. But it talks to Java. That's all that matters. It's a nicer language. And so Ionic sort of levels the playing ground between these, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, if you think about these phones, like there's a lot of similarities between them and the different APIs and sensors they have. And they're also targeting kind of a different type of development background. So what we do is we just try to focus on bringing the web to mobile. That's really like we're focused entirely on web developers, entirely on web technology. And so it's not so much that we're trying to get Android developers or iOS developers to switch to Ionic. That's not really who we're going after. It's more just trying to bring that web platform to mobile in a sense and kind of extend the capabilities of the browser to handle more native API functionality in some respects.
So wouldn't this be the same, or is it different than, say, me just writing smart web apps that would run, say, on Chrome on both platforms?
I think that's kind of a longer term goal of the web platform, is to get to feature parity and capability parity with native platforms. But that reality is actually really, really far off. And I say that as a fan of the web. There are just so many SDKs and APIs that you can access on native platforms that are kind of being released every single new year. Every year there's a new iOS update or what have you. And so the web platform is just kind of always behind on those. And that's not a problem when you think about kind of the most common functionality. The browser increasingly supports that. But for most mobile apps that are going to be in the App Store, they want to take advantage of pretty much all the latest functionality. And so in a sense, you could think of our platform as a modern browser with access to more of that functionality.
Okay, so you're writing to an API that you guys are providing that then invokes from the JavaScript and CSS, sort of invokes the native calls? Is it actually built using native widgets?
So it's running primarily in a web view, but a lot of native functionality is exposed through simple JavaScript calls. So, for example, we have a way to access the Face ID scanner and then store session tokens securely in the keychain on iOS or use the key store on Android. That's something you can't really access in a Chrome browser app or a PWA, but we expose that to you through pretty much a basic JavaScript call, and you can treat it as if it's a browser API.
Okay, how did Ionic get started, and were you involved in that?
Yeah, so the project started back in 2013, and we actually had, so myself and my co-founder of this company started a project called Codica, which was a drag and drop design tool for jQuery mobile. And we were kind of driven by the idea of trying to make application development easier, and really by focusing on bringing the web platform to mobile. And so jQuery mobile back in 2013 was kind of the leading way that you did that. If you were a web developer, that was kind of the toolkit. So we felt like, jQuery mobile was a really great project, but there were a number of key ways that you could make that feel much closer to what a traditional native app felt like. And we, at the same time, this is around the time the iPhone 5 came out, there were a whole bunch of new APIs and functionality in the web views on phones that let you basically get to faster performance in animations, gesture-driven features, and things like that. And so Ionic started as essentially a more native-like jQuery mobile. And this was also around the time that AngularJS, Google's front-end framework, was exploding. This was version 1.2, I think. And it was kind of just like this perfect time where you had a bunch of web developers who were starting to really build serious front-end applications in the browser. And they were using JavaScript to do that. They were using the web platform to do that. But they didn't have an easy way to really build mobile apps or desktop apps with that same skill set. And so we kind of just brought the two together in a sense.
Cool. And so does my mishmash of JavaScript? So you're saying it uses the web toolkit. So we're still talking directly to the DOM, and it's been enhanced with being able to talk to those other native calls. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's kind of two parts to a typical Ionic app. There's the web browser part where most of your UI components are running, where most of your business logic is running. So it's basically just like any other front-end web app. And then there's a native side, which traditionally we used Cordova for. But we also have our own new native layer called Capacitor. And what that does is it basically lets you expose native functionality through plugins to essentially simple JavaScript calls in the web view. So you can expose every single piece of functionality at the native layer through that plugin system. You can show native UI if you want to. You can pretty much access anything as long as there's a plugin for it. And it's also really easy to just write your own code. So if you are comfortable writing a little bit of native code, we will save you like 95% of the time building the core of your app in the web layer, but you can still drop down and add some native code if you want.
And for our audience and also for me, what is Cordova and how is Capacitor different?
Yeah, so Cordova is essentially it takes a web view on iOS and Android and other platforms, but just let's focus on those. And it basically lets you triggers when you call JavaScript, you can trigger native code to run behind the app. So it hosts this web view and then has plugins to basically expose native functionality in the device. And there's like hundreds of these plugins that people have built. There's like a very rich, vibrant community of these plugins. So you can pretty much access anything you want. And if there's not a plugin, you can build your own. So that's Cordova. And we have been using Cordova since we started. And we recently built essentially a evolution of Cordova, we call it, that has a few different opinions about how to structure your app, but also add support for progressive web apps, for Electron apps, because Ionic is increasingly not just for mobile, it's also for desktop and web.
And so I'm also understanding that this is, I think I saw the word Electron somewhere, where you're taking essentially a web view and putting on a desktop app. Does it run on all flavors of desktops?
Yeah, it should run on Linux, Windows, and Mac just fine.
And so this has obviously been in development for a while, and a lot of people are using it these days. What's been the biggest challenge so far since 2013? Where did you surprise yourself somewhere in the middle of the project?
There's been a lot of challenges. I think I would say the biggest one that comes to mind is, and probably anyone who's done front-end development knows this well. Since 2014, we've had a pretty dramatic shift in the types of front-end frameworks that people are using. People call this framework churn, if you will. So Ionic started by basically being a tightly bound UI kit for AngularJS, which was Angular 1. And then Angular 2 came out, and it was totally different. It was based on TypeScript, had a different component model, and so we had to basically rebuild Ionic to work with Angular. And then we kind of realized like we also wanted to support React, we wanted to support Vue, we wanted to support jQuery, we wanted to support vanilla JavaScript, and we couldn't do that because we were very tightly bound to Angular. So we ended up kind of doing a third rewrite, if you will, to move to standard web components, and we built some interesting tooling to get ourselves there. But that kind of framework churn was really kind of slowed us down. And that was probably been one of the biggest challenges. And I think we're kind of like finally past that, which is really exciting.
And so when you talk about supporting web components, that also means you're restricting the set of browsers this can run on, right?
Yeah, there are some limitations. However, we do have polyfills, and we built a tool to basically generate web components from a TypeScript /JSX kind of React style syntax. And we call this project Stencil. So it's another one of our open source projects. This project generates web components, and it also intelligently loads polyfills based on the client. So we only load the polyfill if a client needs it. So we'll support most modern browsers. There's some limited support for Edge and the like using specific polyfills. We try to support as many browsers as possible, but we are focused more on primarily the modern browser runtime.
Cool. So I had a question. Just before we start getting into the weeds too much, I just wanted to back up. We started talking about the need for Cordova, right, which provides that native layer or access to that native layer. And we talked a little bit about Angular. I just want to make sure that people that maybe aren't in this space, because this space has really kind of exploded over the last 5 years. It seems like, to me anyway, with these frameworks, so that you can write the way you want to write, and then have that application work on mobile. So maybe if we could step back a little bit and think, okay, so I'm a developer. I just had this conversation, by the way, with somebody at the Makerspace, so I want to make sure that I understand it right for future conversations. So if I want to write an app for mobile, but I want to use JavaScript and web tools, do I need Angular, Ionic, and Cordova in order to make all that work? Are those the three pieces?
So you at least need you at least need Ionic and Cordova, or our project capacitor. So that will provide you with, it'll run on phones. You can build an app that you can submit to the App Store. And then Ionic is the UI layer, essentially, and kind of provide some of that native functionality. With the new version of Ionic, you have a choice between what front-end framework you want to use on top. So you can use Angular with it. That's kind of our officially supported version today. However, we just released beta version of React support last month, and beta version of Vue support, Vue.js. So, and you can also use these components without a framework, and that's kind of a totally new thing that wasn't possible a few months ago. So we're trying to basically not have an opinion about what you want to use for the actual like state management and logic side of your app, because we're the UI layer. We shouldn't have to care about what you use for that part of your app. But if that makes sense, that's kind of how the pieces are separated.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation. And then what would the corollary be to that over on the React side? Is it, because I know a lot of people seem to be using React Native. I think we may have had React Native on the show. Randall can correct me if I'm wrong, but you talked about Vue and React. So would you use the same tools over there as well? Would you still use Cordova, for example, or would you use is it just React and React Native?
Yeah, you would still use Cordova or our project capacitor in the React world. And the way to think about how Ionic is different than React Native, React Native takes React and JSX and then orchestrates native UI controls. And so in many respects, React Native is also not the same development experience for plain React, because most people are using React with React DOM, and most libraries are written to support the DOM in React DOM. And so what Ionic is it's not trying to be like just a mobile native mobile runtime. It's essentially taking the web platform and bringing it to mobile. So it's similar to just writing a web app. So we use React at work for building our dashboard. And so the idea is the same there. I'm building a front-end web app using React and using Ionic as the UI layer and interacting with native functionality through Cordova or Capacitor. And so you can mix it with React Native, but the two projects are kind of philosophically different.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the explanation. I just feel like we needed to set the stage, so to speak, for what the puzzle pieces were. Randall's saying that we didn't have React or React Native on. I could have sworn we had somebody on. But anyway, my next question is, so when I'm doing this, so when I'm writing my code, can I see kind of a semi-live version of my app so that I can quickly iterate over the changes that I'm making?
Yeah, so there's essentially two ways you can do that. First of all, we have live reload. So if you're running in like a simulator or you're running on a phone and you make a change, it'll update as soon as it rebuilds. Otherwise, my favorite part, I'm a web developer at heart. I like building in the browser. And because Ionic is based on web technology, you can build 90% of the app just in Chrome DevTools without ever pushing to a simulator or pushing to a phone. And if you've done a lot of mobile development, you know that last mile where you're running in the simulator on the phone, it's not as fast as the traditional browser development approach. So we kind of support both, and they will reload when you make changes and all of that. That's
awesome. Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people are looking for, right, is that instant feedback And I love the fact that you don't have to necessarily run an emulator for it, because then you're always thinking like, oh, is this a problem with the emulator, or did it get pushed correctly, or things like that. So I really love that you can do it right in Chrome, and I may have to try that out later. So I know that you're also, some of the messaging, at least on the website, talks a lot about, kind of mobile DevOps, right? DevOps is the big thing now with a lot of companies that are trying to push in that direction to be more agile. So how does this relate to mobile DevOps? How are you enabling that?
Yeah, so Ionic, the project, is kind of like, we're also a business, and the business has some services that are in the mobile DevOps category. And so the idea behind those is we have a lot of developers who are needing to have kind of certain features in order to be agile, if you will. So they need to be able to push updates to their app pretty frequently. They need to do essentially repeatable, consistent cloud builds. So generating an iOS binary for test flight, Android binary for test flight, and kind of have a repeatable build. So we have services available for that. But the fact that we are based on web technology makes it possible for us to have a really fast update feature for apps. Since most of the UI is built using traditional web technology, Apple and Google allow you to essentially push real-time UI updates remotely. So we have a service that does that. So that's kind of the mobile DevOps layer.
Cool. And then the other question I had was, excuse me, how difficult is it to troubleshoot once your application? So we talked a little bit about, developing using Chrome and all that kind of stuff for making changes, but once your application is actually pushed out, are there any tools that can actually we could use to troubleshoot when a problem is occurring once the application is out in the wild?
Yeah, so there are essentially the same tools that you would use for like a website. So if you're using something like Sentry or Raven, the crash and runtime error tracking, that kind of stuff is going to work really well for the web side of your app. So you can track like, hey, with the app through an exception, et cetera. On the crash side, then you're looking at kind of the traditional crash reporting tools like Crashlytics. I think there's like a Firebase feature that does it. And so you kind of, you take two different approaches based on what part of your application you want to track.
Perfect. And then this may be going back to more of the paid product again, but I mentioned at the top of the show that there's something new coming, I believe. I'm just kind of curious if you can tell us a little bit more about Studio and what that is.
Yeah, so this company we've always had a history of building visual design tools. So we have always been driven by the idea that building software is too difficult, and we want more people to be able to do it, and we want more people to be able to do it more quickly. And so when we started, before Ionic, we had a drag and drop tool for jQuery Mobile. And so Studio is kind of like a evolution of that. It is a installable desktop tool that lets you build a lot of the UI visually, but in a way that you can actually go back and forth between code, which is one of those kind of magical things that's always been elusive for these kinds of tools. They tend to be, hey, I'm just going to build a prototype and then I'm going to export it and then I'll get to work. This tool is different. It's actually meant to be something that you spend potentially your entire development time in, and you can switch between working on a template or working on a kind of the visual representation and dragging components, link pages together. So that's what Studio is. It is not quite ready. We are releasing a version of it in the next month or so. So we're really excited about that. But we just hope Ionic tried to make development easier and faster at the kind of engineering level, like writing code and all that stuff using the command line. And this is trying to make it even easier, kind of the GUI level.
Okay. And then but that is going to be for the paid version only, correct?
At first, yes, we were thinking about changing that, but we need to, we want to stick around and be able to work on Ionic for a long amount of time. So we need to make sure we're generating some revenue from it.
Yeah. Got it. So in terms of generating revenue, I'm kind of curious what else is in the enterprise version or the paid version that's not in the free version?
So the actual like Ionic framework, which is our flagship open source project, is totally free. It's free for everyone. It's free for enterprises and individuals, and that's really, really important to us. It's kind of in our way, our best product is the one that's most free and most open source, MIT license, all that. However, we have this natural, convenient separation between teams that have enterprise needs and teams that don't. And so for the teams that do have enterprise needs, we have a bunch of other stuff that we offer. For example, we have different plugins that interact with more enterprise style services like Active Directory, different kind of authentication flows, different security use cases, different offline data storage and local data encryption needs. And so that stuff we tend to focus on enterprise users. And we also have, like, we support the framework. If you pay us money, we actually provide support for the free side, which I think is pretty typical of these types of projects. And it's kind of just things like that. We want to make sure that anything that's useful and valuable to everyone is available to everyone, but stuff that's enterprise specific, we can kind of charge enterprises for directly.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just kind of curious, is who's contributing to the project? Is it, do you get outside contributions, bug fixes or new features, or is it totally in-house? And who works on the roadmap?
Yeah, so most of the development happens in Ionic, the company, and that's just kind of how it's been. That's how we've done it since the beginning. However, I would say something that we're trying to be much better about recently is enabling outside people to contribute. We have had at least 300 people have contributed meaningful improvements to Ionic framework itself. We haven't always been the best at kind of making people aware of parts that we want help on or that we would be good for an outside contributor, because we've been a little bit focused on, we got to get our vision for this completed before we open it up to other people that contribute. So we've been very deliberate about fixing that, and we've had a lot more contributions recently because of that. But that's just been us kind of learning about how do you run this type of open source project where it is, we do have a team working on it, a professional team that's this is their full-time job, but you also want it to enable people to contribute. You don't want to force them to, but if they want to submit something, we need to make that easy. And so we're trying to be a lot better about that.
Well, that's great, because this is the type of project I would think, anyway, given its popularity and how many people are using it, that people would want to contribute. I mean, I'm sure people, just naturally in the course of developing their apps would come up with something that's like, oh, I wish it did this. I can bang that out, or maybe there's an improvement I can make. So I'm really glad to hear that you're trying to become at least more open to contributions from the outside. And I agree, it is a challenge as well. It's not as easy as people think, and depending, unless you grew up that way, right? Like some of the open source projects have done over the years, where they just it's so embedded in their DNA that it's just natural for them. So I'm glad that you're leaning heavily in that direction, and encourage that. One other question, just maybe for people again that aren't as familiar with this, do you know? Are there any stats that you can share with us in terms of how many people are using it, how many apps have been developed using Ionic, and are there any apps that people would know that they're maybe using today on their phone that have been written using Ionic?
Yeah, so we've seen several million apps built on Ionic since we started. Over 5 million is something that we track. And obviously, not all of those are shipped to the App Store and actually in customers' hands, but that's a lot of apps being built. And it's not one of the interesting things that we're seeing in this space is a lot of us think like, okay, Ionic is for building mobile apps, right? Consumer mobile apps. And that's really just one piece of it. We're seeing a ton of enterprise development happening internally, things that are never, ever going to see the light of day in the App Store, things that are being built quickly for very specific line of business needs. And actually, I think that represents some of the most development that's happening in bigger companies. So it's kind of a mixture of of consumer and enterprise. So on the consumer side, apps that you might know, Untapped, the beer rating app, is built with Ionic. So if you're ever out drinking beer, as some of us find ourselves, and you want to kind of brag about some cool beer you're drinking, Untapped can help you do that. Another consumer one that people might know is Sworkit, which is a popular workout app. And then we also have some other apps like Nationwide and AAA and Amtrak have built apps on Ionic. So those are kind of a few. And there's a bunch of exciting ones in the works that I can't talk about just yet, but it's pretty good diversity, and it's not just mobile. And I know that's I mentioned that before, but we're seeing a lot of demand for desktop apps, especially with bigger companies. They're trying to build stuff that's going to be usable for everyone in the company, and as most of us creatives know, like most of our hardcore work still gets done on a desktop. Or a laptop. And so being able to support those types of users in the office while also supporting field workers through mobile is kind of a must-have for a lot of these companies. So we try to support all of that. And then obviously there's this kind of groundswell of interest in web apps and progressive web apps, and that's a little bit nascent. I think the whole industry is still a little bit early there, but that's another thing that we're increasingly seeing Ionic being used for.
Well, Aaron has a bunch more questions, but I've got a bunch more questions too. But before we get to my questions, I do have to say that this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by DigitalOcean. Easily run production applications with DigitalOcean, a scalable compute platform with add-on storage, security, and monitoring capabilities. Whether you're running one virtual machine or 10,000, DigitalOcean has you covered with the flexibility to customize standard or CPU-optimized droplets. Set up an SSD-based virtual machine in 55 seconds or less. Capture backups and snapshots. DigitalOcean is designed for developers. The easy-to-use control panel and API lets developers spend more time coding and less time managing their infrastructure. Use Kubernetes to improve availability, scalability, and resource efficiency of containerized apps. Over 2,000 open-source tutorials available for developers. On DigitalOcean's marketplace, discover and deploy pre-configured one-click applications, including LAMP, Docker, GitLab, Jenkins, Plesk, cPanel, WordPress, and many more. Find an application that suits your case, then spin it up on a droplet in 60 seconds or less. Industry-leading price performance. Access the computing resources you need at the lowest rates, saving up to 55% compared to other cloud providers. Know what you'll pay monthly with predictable and straightforward billing. And included at no additional cost. Monitoring and alerts, 99.99% uptime SLA, team accounts, cloud firewalls, full DNS management, 12 global data centers. Data centers located around the world means you have connectivity and redundancy you need to provide the best service to your customers. 24/7, 365 world-class support. DigitalOcean is trusted by over 1 million developers. Go to do.co/twit today, sign up and receive a free $100 credit. That's do.co/TWIT for a free $100 credit. DigitalOcean, designed for developers, built for businesses, and we thank DigitalOcean for their support of Floss Weekly. And let's go ahead and get back to some questions here. So after you said that last question about, okay, how many things do you think are in the app stores that are using this thing, and also desktop, is there a secret handshake that I could use with an app to discover whether it is done in Ionic or not?
Yeah, there is. So we don't track apps that are actually deployed. We deliberately don't do that. That's really not our business on the open source side. However, if you go and take a look at an app in the App Store and you download the archive of the actual binary, it's pretty easy to see whether or not it's built with Ionic. It will have web content in it. It will have Ionic references. And so if we want to check to say, hey, was that app built with Ionic? Because there are a lot of apps that we don't know about because people use the project and don't tell us. That tends to be how we figure it out.
And what sort of tooling do you have? I know that one of the things I really like about Flutter is that it works with Android Studio and with IntelliJ Community Edition and also with VS Code. Am I able to do Ionic with those kind of applications?
Yeah, so we don't have specific integrations with those tools. We have at least not Android Studio, but we do have there's some integration with VS Code. So there's some autocomplete for HTML tags. There's tools to actually build and run and test your apps through VS Code. And then the Studio project is kind of our first big step towards improving the tooling even more. Ionic historically has been command line driven. So we try to have really simple command line experience where you just need to type Ionic run and the app runs. And that tends to be how most people use Ionic today, but we're increasingly adding these kind of visual niceties to improve that process. So that's coming soon.
And I also want to talk a little bit more about the community things. I know Aaron was getting into that a little bit, but some projects are managed by having their main GitHub repo be a clone from an internal one that gets scraped to make sure that nothing's getting leaked out of the company that shouldn't be. Are you using the live GitHub repo for Ionic, or do you do the scraping thing?
Yeah, everything happens in public. Thankfully, we're not a massive company like Google where we have a bunch of kind of legal things we need to watch for. We can move really quickly. We can be very transparent about everything that is happening. I would say sometimes in the past when we've had to kind of do a rewrite, we've maybe kept that private for a little bit while we just figured out the details. But we tend to do all our open source development in public. We submit pull requests, we comment on issues, we track where our kind of our project roadmap through the GitHub projects feature, or I think we had another tool that we used to do that. So we publish meeting notes every week that we have a meeting. So we try to keep the open source stuff really, really transparent and public.
Yeah, and unlike Google, you can actually talk about dates. So they can't do that because that's a forward-looking statement, and they can't do that in public because they're a publicly traded company. So that probably helps a bit too. And so you're actually watching the issues in GitHub against your projects.
Yep, exactly. And we have built some tools to facilitate that. We kind of have a lot of GitHub repos that we've spread different smaller projects around. And so we have some tooling that'll kind of help us know, like, hey, this issue is really popular. It's getting a lot of reactions. It's getting a lot of comments. And so that's if you don't have tools, you kind of drown in some of the activity on GitHub. So we try to make that easier. Otherwise, it's not really manageable.
And how hard would it be for me to get started with Ionic? I need to get the platform. I need to get Cordova. Obviously, I need a project. I mean, yes?
Yeah, so we have pretty simple instructions on our website, but basically you need to install a few things. You need to have Node.js. Everything we do runs on Node. That's probably just a good thing to have installed in general if you're a web developer.
Yep.
And then you'll install Cordova or Capacitor, our new project, in the process of that, and then that's pretty much all you need.
And this is strictly UI, so it's not like there'd be any support then for, say, ORMs over on the Node.js side, right? Yeah,
that's not really in the domain of what we do.
Okay. And you built this to work with AngularJS. That's went through some radical changes in the last few years. Does that actually confuse what you're doing?
Yeah, so there was a question before about soliciting contributions from the community. And one of the challenges that we've had is we've had to rewrite Ionic a few times, which has made it difficult to get outside people to help because the project is basically being rebuilt. And the reason we've had to do that is because Angular, we were very tightly coupled to Angular 1, and then Angular 2 came out and we didn't want to get left behind. So we ended up doing the same thing and being tightly coupled to Angular 2. And then obviously React exploded in popularity at Vue.js, et cetera. So we did that a third time, and hopefully the last time, where we moved everything to web components and actually built a bunch of tooling to kind of push the web component ecosystem forward. And now we hopefully won't have to do that again. So yeah, we've been through that framework churn. We've had a front row seat to it in many respects.
Yeah, I know the Angular Dart community went through a similar thing when they were originally being built from the same code base. I think it was in TypeScript, and then they decided to fork. And the Angular Dart people are still keeping pretty close to track sort of the top-level semantics of AngularJS, except that there's no longer a one-to-one correlation for some things, because some things make sense only in Dart and other things make sense only in JS. And so that's why they split the code bases. But Angular Dart has come a long ways from 1.0 to 5.0, and it's made everything that I read on the net 2 or 3 years ago about Angular Dart useless because it's all different again. Same thing with Dart 2.0. Is the same thing happened there. Is it from Dart 1.0 to Dart 2.0, going from a permissive framework where you had optional typing to being a very strongly typed language. It really sort of broke up everybody who had written stuff about it more than 3 years ago. So doing that way as well. Are there good tutorials at Ionic if I wanted to get started?
Yeah, so you have a lot of options there. There are people in the community that have written a bunch of content, a bunch of tutorials. And so we have some of them on our website on the community page. I would definitely check that out. If you are a member of some of the online learning sites like Pluralsight or Egghead and things like that, there are video courses. There are books on Amazon you can check out for Ionic. We have some tutorials in our documentation. So it's one of the best parts about Ionic is this organic community of really passionate people that's built up around the project. And so in many respects, their stuff is better than ours. And a lot of them do this full time. And so that's, I would definitely check out the community page on our webpage for that.
Wonderful. And you mentioned PWAs earlier. I'm not sure our audience is fully aware of what those are. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So PWAs stand for Progressive Web Apps, and it's kind of it's a name for a collection of modern web APIs that enable browser apps to have more typical mobile or app functionality, if you will. So, for example, being able to run code offline, being able to store data offline through service workers is one of the key APIs. Being able to access some new modern web APIs, some new authentication APIs. It's kind of becoming a catch-all term for the web becoming more like a native mobile platform, if you will. And so what we're seeing with people, and we have a slightly different opinion on PWAs than the average maybe web purist does. For us, one of the awesome things about PWAs is you can really activate users that are coming through Google search or through the web without forcing them to go and download an app. There's a bunch of data that's been published recently that says users aren't installing apps, they're deleting apps, but they're not keeping new apps around. So unless you are Facebook or whatever, one of the top apps in the App Store, it's kind of a hard sell to get someone to go and download and install a new app. And so PWAs are a really great way to get someone into an app-like experience from a Google search, from a web link. And then when they get used to the product and they get used to the service, one of the value props with Ionic is you can also build a native app with the same code base. So if you want them to install a native app, maybe to access deeper native functionality or what have you, you can do both at the same time. So to us, it's all about distribution. It's don't lose users because you're forcing them to download an app, and the web getting more powerful. And we don't see it necessarily as killing native apps. We see them coexisting, and we support both.
Yeah, so that's exactly what my question was going to be, and you answered it a little bit there. Is what role does Ionic play? Does it play at all in the PWA, or is it only when you make that jump to a native app that you would use Ionic just for the native app?
It plays a large role in the PWA space, and the reason it does is because browsers don't give you UI controls out of the box. Everything that you build, you have to build from scratch. I think every web developer knows that. We've used Bootstrap, we've used Material, what have you. So Ionic is kind of a opinionated UI kit to help you build apps that look and feel like mobile apps. So if you build a PWA with Ionic, you are going to get a experience that's more like a traditional mobile app. Things like navigations and transitions that are fluid, that have gestures. Maybe you want a tabbed interface that works correctly. It has correct navigation semantics. Touch-enabled controls. There's a whole bunch of them that, frankly, Ionic has some of the best touch-enabled controls out there. And so that's if you don't use something like Ionic, you have to rebuild a lot of that from scratch or try to get Bootstrap, for example, to work well with it. And so that's the value we provide there. But we also have the added benefit of being able to take that app and run it as a quality mobile app for the app stores and potentially a desktop app if you want to. So we absolutely play a huge role there. The other thing that we do that's interesting is we've been building out a bunch of essentially native style UI experiences for common sensors. So, for example, the camera. When you build a web app that uses the camera, you're using like the WebRTC APIs. So you're streaming essentially the camera to a div. And that's all you get. You don't get like the iPhone or Android camera experience where you've got the nice button to press, where you can adjust exposure, where you can switch the camera from front to back. You have to build all that stuff yourself. And so we also have these these experiences on top of the web APIs that make these things feel like you're actually running in a native experience. So that's another thing that you get when you use Ionic for PWAs.
Thank you. That's a fantastic answer. That's exactly what I was looking for. I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts about progressive web apps in general. I mean, I remember when Google launched or announced or talked about progressive web apps, I think at Google I/O, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago or something. And, I thought by now we would just be seeing way more web apps than at least I am aware that we're seeing. Now, it could be that they're fooling me and I'm using progressive web apps more often than I think I am. But why don't you think that or correct me if I'm wrong, have progressive web apps really taken off, or why haven't they? Why aren't they being used more?
Well, that answer depends on whether you're an iOS user or an Android user. If you're on iOS like I am, you probably won't notice as much of the web being PWA enabled. And the reason for that is some of the PWA support on iOS is pretty new. But a lot of apps actually have PWA support. So me personally, I'm a big Twitter user. I've switched most of my Twitter usage to the web. And that's something that took me... I didn't think I was going to do it, and then all of a sudden I was like, I don't want the app anymore. I don't want to open it anymore. I use Firefox for my browser on the phone, and it just was so easy to just open up the Twitter app, and that's a progressive web app. On Android, there's a lot more functionality that you can get from a PWA, so you probably would see it more there. Like Starbucks has PWAs, Pinterest has PWAs, and these are actually, if you go and look at some of the reports they've done on the just kind of the business impact of these PWAs, they're actually pretty significant. They're seeing people stay in the app much longer. They're seeing them, frankly, clicking on ads more often, and they're just really moving the needle for a lot of business metrics. So that's the exciting side. I would say the reason we don't see as many just yet is there's just a bias towards apps in the App Store. And I think one of the things that the PWA marketing and ecosystem needs to be a little bit more flexible with is that's okay. We can have them coexist. They don't need to kill each other, which is kind of how the kind of thought process is right now. It's like an either or. If you make that a little more flexible and have them coexist, then I think people will be more willing to do it, because if you can get a 20 to 30% increase in some key metric that's really important for your business by adding a PWA to the mix, not replacing a native app, but adding one, like that should be a no-brainer, I think, for most companies. And so Starbucks and Pinterest are showing that that's the case. And I think we'll start to see more of that.
Yeah, awesome. And that's why you need Ionic to make the whole thing easier between native and progressive web apps. Love it. So I know we mentioned Studio kind of on the commercial side or the enterprise side, and we talked about support for Vue and React coming. Anything else that's coming down the pike that you'd like to let our audience know about?
So I think for once in the life of this company, that answer is kind of no. And actually, and if you follow Ionic, you'll probably find that to be a nice answer, because we have been changing a lot of things. We've been adding a lot of things. Where we're trying to get to is we want to focus on our components. We want to make sure that they're really fast, they're really stable, they continue to work no matter what web technology you use. And so we are kind of focusing on making Ionic really stable and just continuing to improve it, instead of constantly moving to the new framework of the month or what have you, because now we can just support those things out of the box. So in some respects, if you're in the Ionic community, you find that welcome change, because now we actually have the time to really focus on that instead of chasing new frameworks. However, one of the things that we're really interested in that does have some new potentially product impacts is this concept of design systems. So we're seeing a lot of demand with larger companies that are trying to standardize on a design system. So a lot of these companies are sick of building maybe like 5 different date pickers. They're sick of having the brand guidelines not consistently enforced. They're sick of building poor components, each team having to build their own components every time they build like a web app or what have you, and they build them poorly because this stuff's hard. They want to focus on their app instead of building components. And so design systems has become kind of just kind of came out of nowhere, and we're getting asked about it a ton from big companies. And so that's something that we're trying to figure out how we can help that, jump on that bandwagon, if you will. And maybe there's some product potential there, but that's kind of a new trend.
Cool. We're almost out of time, but I did want to ask you before we let you go, about 3 questions, but let's see if we can keep them all brief. How do you test this? And how can I test the things I write?
So we do a bunch of UI testing. We call it a screenshot tool, but we essentially run tests of every single one of our components, and we compare like visual diffs between the actual rendered output. So if you change like some CSS and it changes like a margin or something, we will show that as a failed visual test. So that's kind of how we test our UI. Otherwise, if you want to test your business logic, we support, you just write unit tests like you do in your framework of choice. So Angular has a way of testing, you just do that. And then if you want to do continuous device testing, there's a bunch of services that do that out there. AWS has some, Azure has some, and there you're actually running your app essentially on test phones and then recording a session or running like a visual unit test, if you will. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. And we tend to focus more on the visual and unit test side for our part of the puzzle.
Cool. And another probably tough question to answer, but because I stated my bias at the beginning of the show, now that you see Google in your rearview mirror with Flutter coming right at you, are you scared?
Well, I think the important thing to think about with Ionic is we are focused on the web platform, and Flutter is not the web platform. They have some basic support for web with, I think they call it Hummingbird, but that is not a traditional web development environment at all. So it's not so much that we're trying to compete against Flutter and React Native, et cetera. What we're trying to do is just make sure that you can build really great apps with the web platform. And we feel like if we can just be kind of web native and really align with where the web platform's going, it's hard to lose because the web platform is one of the most widely used and developed on platforms out there. So we just have a very different philosophical approach. I think Dart and some of these native cross-platform tools that aren't based on the web, like that space is really, really noisy and you have a lot of choices. But if you want to use the web platform and deploy to all these different devices and platforms using your traditional web development skill set, we still think Ionic's the best game in town, and that's where we're focusing. So I think over time, that philosophical difference will pan out to be much more significant. So for example, the fact that we can easily support progressive web apps and we support web components is just something that you just can't easily do in something like Flutter. It's not really part of the tech stack at all there. So that's how we see us kind of being different over the long term.
That's a fair answer, absolutely fair answer, and thank you for being upfront with me about that. 3 more questions. Is there anything, like I said, we're almost out of time, so we've got to wrap this up quick, but that hour just goes by so fast. Is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you want to make sure our audience is aware of before we let you go?
We talked about a lot of things. I would say if you've looked at Ionic before, but you didn't want to use Angular, we, just to reiterate, we just announced React support, a beta version soon, but that is going to quickly become one of our primary supported frameworks, and we will have deeper integration with different routing systems, different build systems. So if you were ever on the fringes, you want to use Ionic, but we didn't support your framework of choice, just know that that's a huge priority for us, especially React support and Vue support are going to be major. So I would just leave with that.
Cool. And you're definitely a coder, at least you were before you became management, I guess. But what's your favorite text editor?
I'm still a coder. Okay. I feel like this is where I need to say that I use Vim. But the reality is I've moved to VS Code, and
VS Code. He said VS Code. Yes.
I do use VS Code, but I installed the Vim binding so I can at least get around.
I use VS Code, but I installed the Emacs binding, so I'm right there with you. So my hands already have the right keystrokes memorized. Yes, that's fine. And what's your favorite programming language?
It's got to be JavaScript, but if it wasn't JavaScript, I actually really fell in love with Swift recently. I write a decent amount of native code still, and I really enjoy Swift.
Cool. Well, it's been great talking to you. I'm really looking forward to bringing you back in a couple of years and tell us how it's gone. Presuming they're still letting me do this show. So far I've made it 12 years, so they haven't kicked me off yet. So come back in a couple of years and tell us how it went.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for the opportunity to be on here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. That was Max Lynch talking to us about Ionic. What do you think there, Aaron?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I really especially enjoyed the PWA discussion as well. And I think that having a tool like Ionic that kind of helps you bridge the gap, so to speak, between progressive web app and native, and still lets you develop the way that you want to develop, is pretty cool. I know that there's desktop progressive web apps now as well. And so, yeah, I always think that, if I wanted to get back into, some sort of mobile development, that progressive web apps would be the way to go. But, I guess it depends on what you're trying to do. So anyway, really interesting stuff. I'm glad to hear that the support for React and Vue is coming, because I think that'll really help them broaden their base with folks that just for whatever reason like React or Vue better. So yeah, really interesting times that we live in here with mobile development.
And I'm still going to express my continuous reaction, let's put it that way, to JavaScript. Ick. Just ick. I don't care if you put nice object layers on top of it. It's still JavaScript. There's still 7 ways to say false and 11 ways to say true. That's just crazy. I like Dart, where it's just a Boolean true or false. There's no other ways to do that. Anyway, coming up next week, we're almost out of time. I got to get going here. Next week, it's the abuse of Postgres. Aquameta, it's a web development environment where instead of storing code as flat files in the file system, everything is stored in Postgres as relational data, including the source code, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, and other resources, system configurations, database schema, permissions, and more. So, yes, we're going to be abusing Postgres. They were on the show a couple of years ago, and they said we've made a lot of progress. Hopefully, they got it working now. Ha ha ha. All right. So Cyclone DX is immediately following that. That's a lightweight software bill of material specification. So it's not actually any code, but it's a specification that people can share now to say, my project uses this, and therefore you can mechanically analyze all my upstreams and get that going. There's a few other solutions in the space, but apparently Cyclone is sort of gaining traction. Just added to the schedule, Teleport and Gravity. Teleport is privileged access management for elastic infrastructure, and Gravity is opinionated, snapshot-based Kubernetes packaging and management tools. I saw these guys at, I think, Scale. So they've contacted me since Scale to say, we would like to be on the show. That show's going to be at an unusual time. We normally Wednesday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. That show is actually going to be Thursday at 2 p.m. So those of you that are in Australia and used to have to worry about getting up too early to watch the show, well, now you got yourself a show you can watch. Also means it's going to be difficult for me to find a co-host for that show because most of my co-hosts are in Europe, or further east anyway. RavenDB as a NoSQL document database. Barrios Backup is a 100% open source fork of the backup project from Bacula.org. It's been in development since 2010, and there's a lot of new features. We're going to get one of the experts from the IBM Cloud Platform to talk about the full stack cloud platform that spans public, private, and hybrid environments. I'm sure there'll be some elevator pitches in there for their actual platform, but everything that you're going to do with them, you could also do with all the other 15 or 20 providers that have this sort of stuff. So Cloud Foundry people. So we're there from Cloud Foundry. Just added to the schedule as well. CryptPad. CryptPad is a private by design alternative to popular Office tools and cloud services. All the content stored on CryptPad is encrypted before being sent, which means that nobody can access your data unless you give them the keys, not even the company. So that's kind of cool. Redis is going to return after being gone for a couple of years. They haven't been gone. They just haven't been on the show. Open source, in-memory data structure store used as a database, cache, and message broker. So basically key value stores are going to be the sort of the 2 or 3 of the shows coming up. That'll be kind of fun as well. We have a live chat room at twit.tv/floss. You can watch us tape the show and make mistakes behind the scenes. If you have any other suggestions, please tell the project leader or community coordinator to email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. My address is on that page at twit.tv/floss. We have a live stream at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesdays, usually, except for that upcoming show. You can follow us at Floss Weekly on Twitter. You can follow me at Merlin on Twitter. Again, I was just at Cloud Foundry, had a great time there, talked to some potential guests. We're still sort of nailing some of those down. I'll be hopefully at the Pro Conference in Pittsburgh in mid-June. In OSCON, of course, I'm going to be at OSCON in Portland. I mean, it's just get on the MAX train and head down, and I'm done. So, because I live in Portland. Occasionally I'm there. Anything you want to plug there, Aaron?
Yeah, I got a few things. Number one, you can always pick up a copy of my book, Linux for Makers. Let's see if the camera will zoom in on that. The Linux for Makers. So you can pick up a copy of my book if you are using Raspberry Pi especially, and you don't understand how Linux works or you haven't used it before. It's a great primer or tutorial, kind of take you through step-by-step, hands-on, how to explore Linux and learn about Linux. So you can do that. The other big thing that's coming up on April 27th, and actually, John, I don't know if you've got the website up, but the Steam Discovery Festival is coming up here in Benicia. It's for the whole Bay Area. You can think of it kind of like a mini Maker Faire, was what we used to call it anyway. We've kind of broadened that out to cover STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And we have a lot of really cool exhibits coming. Some fire art, if you like swinging on I don't know what this thing is. It's called the Constellation Cannon. You swing on this thing and it launches fireballs in the air. I don't know what's going on. You can see a picture in the background there of our laser maze that we built at Benicia Makerspace. So again, that's coming up on April 27th at Benicia High School. And you can see the tickets there, but go to steamdiscoveryfestival.com for more information. Really cool stuff. We hope to see lots of people there on the 27th.
Awesome. And Aaron, thank you once again for contributing your expertise to one of these shows, and I hope you come back many times more. So thank you for being back.
Oh, yeah, anytime.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're out of time, so we'll see you all again next week on Floss Weekly.